I mean, I think the question always about Rerum Novarum, which is the document, the papal document that really is the founding document of this Catholic social teaching tradition. The question always is, how opportunistic was it? You know, I mean, the European working classes were being lost rapidly to atheistic socialism, and the church thought it had better get in on the act quickly. So I don't know, but in the course of doing that, of course, they said some important things that are still with us, like, you know, the rights of working persons, the right to a just wage, the right to time off, the right to pensions, the right to free collective bargaining, all things, by the way, that the secular society has been much better at than the church itself, but that's another story. So there's this long tradition of Catholic social teaching, and it's more I think its fundamental principles are things that pop in and out of the fabric of American society and other societies too. Like, so people, of course, the notion of human rights is very dominant in Western culture, individual human rights and collective rights. I'm not sure if the list of rights that secular societies accept is as long as the list that Pope John the 23rd came up with, because he included things like the right to work, which is problematic, because you're not sure if you can have a right to something that you can't guarantee. Catholic social teaching as that body of teachings is one thing. Catholic commitment to social justice is less tied to the documentary tradition, I think. And you know, you see it, I think, more in organizations like, on the one side, Catholic Charities, the second large, after the federal government, the largest direct aid provider in the United States. And you see it in more sophisticated, I don't mean to put down Catholic Charities, it's an important organization, but more intellectually sophisticated operations like the great lobbying organization Network, which pushes Congress on issues of justice. Not everyone who is conversant with the Catholic social teaching tradition is necessarily on the same page politically, or their political visions vary, and I suppose that's to be expected. But one principle that I think you put aside at your peril is a principle of Catholic social teaching that really was, nobody had ever used the phrase until the late 1960s, and that's the phrase, the option for the poor, the preferential option for the poor, which fundamentally means, when you're talking about social and political issues, and you're talking about bills in Congress and legislation and all that, it fundamentally means that when you look at any proposed piece of legislation, let's say, from an ethical perspective, you have to look at the poorest, least advantaged members of society and ask, how would this affect them? Not, on the whole, would most people be better off with this piece of legislation, but how would the legislation affect the least socially advantaged people? And if the answer is it would affect them negatively, or nothing would change for them but everybody else would be better off, then ethically, certainly from a Catholic social justice perspective, you have to say this piece of legislation doesn't fly. So I think, you know, you can argue about taxation structures, but you can never say, I think, a flat tax is fair, because you take 5% of a poor person's salary and that makes the difference between eating and not eating, and you take 5% of even a moderately comfortable middle-class person, and frankly they wouldn't notice. And you take 5% from the high-ups and they'd find a way to turn it into a profit. So that's an example, I think, of how you could, you know, our social priorities have to reflect concern for the least advantaged members of society, which primarily means the poor, although it could also mean children, it could also mean single parent families, it could also mean the elderly, homebound, prisoners, all the people who show up in Matthew chapter 25, where it's a rather disquieting chapter where God decides who's going to heaven and who's going to hell based not upon who says they believe in God, but who does justice to those in need. Something I think that should actually be entered into the congressional record every year, but I don't think it is.